So now let's actually write some code that can process videos. And we're going to keep it relatively simple in this video. We're just going to do it locally, and we're going to convert videos from the given resolution into 360p. Of course, we could do it into a variety of formats, but just to keep it simple, I just want to show you the entire workflow. I'm sure you can figure out how to do it in multiple formats, but we're going to start in our index.ts file, and we don't really need this hello world endpoint anymore. We're going to create a new endpoint, but before we even do that, let me show you the dependencies that we're going to need. So I'm going to open up the terminal, and I'm going to run npm install I for short Fluent ffmpeg. This is the library that we're going to use. ffmpeg is the library we're going to use to process videos. It's a pretty popular library, so this isn't like something super obscure that I'm showing you. So we're going to run that, and I'm going to clear, and then I'm going to run npm install save dev. We're going to install the types for Fluent ffmpeg, which is recommended, but it's probably not required, but I recommend you do it as well. Now, there's one more important step. I want to mention that ffmpeg is actually just a wrapper. So above here, I'm going to quickly show you how we can import it. It's pretty easy. We can run import ffmpeg, and it might even autocomplete for us. Well, Copilot took over, but if it weren't for Copilot, I think we would still be able to autocomplete this. And maybe if I can get it to work by ignoring Copilot, guess not. It's pretty easy to import this. We have our package. I want to mention this is just a wrapper around the ffmpeg CLI tool. It's a CLI tool, meaning it's a command line tool, and installing this wrapper won't do anything if your host machine, if your computer does not have the actual CLI tool installed. This is just a way for us to use this tool outside of the command line, inside of our TypeScript code. So it's very important that you also install ffmpeg, and I'll show you how to do that on Ubuntu. This is the command that we can run, sudo apt-get update. That's just going to kind of update our package registry, which is usually good to do. It's not always required, but it's good to kind of do that. And then after that, assuming it completes, we're going to then install ffmpeg. Once again, the Y flag just means it's going to accept all of the prompts that it gives us. So I'll run that even though I actually already have it installed. So that completed pretty quickly. Depending on your operating system, the install steps might be different. I'll leave a link for you in the article. But now let's get into the interesting part, writing the code. So we actually don't want a GET request. I'm going to just delete this code here, but we can't reuse this endpoint because we actually want a POST request. And I'll go ahead and actually call this that. This is not going to be the root endpoint anymore. It's going to be called process video. So keep that in mind when we want to actually test this out locally. And the request in a POST request actually has a body. That's why we're using a POST request, because we need that body. We're going to expect that the body has the path of the input video file that we want to convert. I'm going to just make a comment here to make that very clear for you, but basically the input video path is going to be from the request body, and let's say that it's called this. And I'm actually going to call this the file path. So not a big deal, just a name. But we're also going to expect that the request in this case also has the same exact thing for the output. So basically we're going to be given a video file, and we're going to convert that into 360p and then save it. And all of this is going to be done on our local file system. Just to keep things simple for now, we're just kind of learning how this whole process works. And then we'll move all of this stuff to actually work in the cloud later on. So output video path, and we expect that the request body has something like this. Now with TypeScript, this code will execute, but it's possible that these parameters aren't actually given in the request body. So a good error handling technique is to have something like this, just to check that this is not undefined and that the output file is also not undefined. Because if it is, then we can't process the video, obviously. So then we would want to say result.status 400, because 400 means it's a client error. They gave us the wrong parameters. They gave us the wrong request. So we can't do anything for them. So we send back to them a useful error message, hopefully, like bad request, missing file path. I guess we could also specify like whether it was the input file or the output file missing. To keep it simple, I'm just not going to do that. But I encourage you to do that if you would like. It's not a bad thing to do. So now for the actual interesting part, actually converting the video. So we're going to use that ffmpeg package that we imported, and we're going to call it on the input file. We're running ffmpeg and we are converting the video, and we can specify how we want to with the output options like this, and we're not going to tab complete. Copilot's getting a bit distracting here. I might have to turn it off at some point. One, we're going to say that this is a video file that we are working with. So we can do that by saying -VF. We're working with a video, and what we want to do is scale it into 360p. This is kind of the syntax to do that. Of course, I'm sure you know that there's plenty of documentation on FFmpeg, and I'm sure you could Google it if you wanted like a different resolution or different kinds of options, but we're going to keep it simple. We're just converting this into 360p. And then we can chain this with a couple events, like when the processing is completed, which is on the end event, we want to run this code. We want to run this anonymous function, and we'll add some code there in just a second, but there's also the possibility that we have an error. So we can actually handle that as well, like this, passing in another anonymous function with the error object. And in that case, there's not much we would really be able to do. So let's just say we can console.log that an error occurred, and we can have the error message just like that. And in this case, we would also want to terminate this endpoint, but in this case, just like Copilot is suggesting to us, we would want to pass in a 500 level code, because that means that there was some internal server error. It wasn't necessarily the client's fault, but once again, we would send an error message and we would say it's an internal server error, and this is like the specific message that we would get. A common error that can occur is that we run out of memory. Like maybe our machine wasn't allocated enough memory and we were given a really large like video file. So in that case, we would want to know like, why didn't the processing succeed? Now at the end, assuming that everything works successfully, we can then save the output file, but we have to specify the path. And thankfully that's given to us as a parameter, so we don't even have to worry about it, just like that. And assuming that that works successfully, we can then return a 200 level code, meaning that everything was complete. Video processing started. Now, this is actually good because this function, as you can imagine, is asynchronous. That means that this could actually execute, this line here will execute probably before the video processing is complete. So that's exactly why we have this callback here. So actually, we're going to move this into the callback here. We know that one of these two are going to execute, so we're either going to return a 500 level code or we're going to return a 200 level code once the processing is complete. And to make it a bit more explicit, I'm actually going to say video processing finished successfully. And now that I actually think about it, we probably don't need a return here, because I think if we end up returning early in one of these callbacks, we might not execute the save. So here I'm actually not going to have a return statement within this. Now we're almost ready to test this locally. Actually, we pretty much are ready to test it locally, but there's one other thing I want to quickly show you before I forget, and that is that we can set the port like this. We declared it up above, so I'm going to remove that line here, and I'm actually going to declare it down here where it's actually being used, and I'm going to set it to process.environment.port. And that's because this is kind of a standard way to provide the port at runtime. And when we actually deploy this code, we're not necessarily going to be running this on port 3000. We might be running it on a different port, and that port can be provided as an environment variable. It's possible that that environment variable is not declared. Like in our case, when I'm running this locally, this is not going to be defined. So the way this expression will evaluate is this is undefined, therefore the port will be set to 3000. This is a pretty standard technique. You don't necessarily have to memorize it. It's something you could probably Google very easily, but it is very, very important when we actually deploy our code. But that's not what we're going to do right now. We're actually going to test this out locally. So let's open up our terminal, and within the video processing service, let's call npm run start. Now we have our service started successfully. Cool. How can we send a request to it to process a video? First of all, we are going to need a video. So I won't show you how to create a video. I just happen to have a video saved locally. And what I did is I copied that video into the video processing directory, not into the source directory, because the path is going to kind of matter here, because when we ran npm start, we ran it from the video processing directory. That's kind of the same context that's going to be used when we are trying to read and write a file from our code. Now for us to actually test it, and by the way, any type of video file should work. In my case, I'm using a .mov. An MP4 should also probably work. Now to test this out, we're going to open up our extensions in VS Code and search for Thunder Client. You could also use Postman. You could also use curl via the CLI. I like using Thunder Client. It's pretty easy, lightweight, and it's like within VS Code, so it makes things super easy. I already have it installed, but I recommend you installing it as well. Then I'm going to go ahead and open it up. In this case, I'm going to create a new request, even though I have the old one saved here. In the new request, we are going to call a post request because we defined a post endpoint, and the URL, of course, is going to be localhost on port 3000. And if you forget what the path of our endpoint was, that's why we wrote it down in our code. So I'm going to copy and paste that, process video, and we care about the body because that's going to specify what file we're actually trying to convert. And in case you forgot, like the parameters, it's going to be input file path and output file path. So I'm going to do that just like this. This is a JSON body because that's kind of the easiest way to do this. And what is going to be the file path? Well, it's going to be /neetcode intro.mov. I think that's about what we had. Yep. And the output, let's just say, is going to be pretty much the exact same thing. So I'm just going to copy and paste that, except we're going to call it process. We're going to add the processed prefix so we can kind of distinguish between the two. And I think we have a trailing comma here, so I'm going to get rid of that. And now our body is good to go. So it's the moment of truth. Let's run it and see if we were successfully able to process a video. And it actually looks like we got an error, and that's my bad because I forgot just a single line of code, but it is a good thing to clarify. And that is, by default, we are making requests with JSON bodies. And that's typically the standard. That's kind of why it's the first option here. People sometimes also use XML, but we're not going to be doing that. In order for our Express server to know that, we have to initialize it as such. So we have to say express.useExpress.json. So we're kind of adding some middleware so that it can actually handle the request. So I'm going to run that, and then I'm going to just restart our server. Sorry for the confusion, by the way. And now let's go back and make the request. And now you can see we actually did get a successful response. Processing finished successfully. And that was pretty quick because in my case, the video is only like 4 seconds long, and I have a pretty decent computer that's running right now. So let's see what we got. Going to our file explorer here, we can see the original video, which is like the NeetCode intro. I can show it to you in just a second, and we can see the processed video. Let's see if it's what we expect. So on Windows, I'm going to right click this and then click reveal in Explorer. So this should open up our file system, and I'll quickly show you the original video. You can see this is pretty much what it's like. I think it's 1080p, and the file size is about 8,000 kilobytes. You can see the processed video. It's the exact same format. It's a MOV file, but it's a small fraction because we basically converted it to 360p, and you can tell that by seeing how bad the resolution looks. So that is pretty much what I wanted to show you for now, but you can see we're getting closer to our end goal, which is to ultimately deploy this in a scalable way. But this is a very good first start.